welcome to the election show on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm your host, Dr. Christina Greer. I'm an associate professor of political science at Fordham University and co-host of the FAQ NYC podcast. Joining me today, as always, via Zoom is Matt McDermott, communications strategist and vice president of Whitman Insight Strategies. And also with me is political analyst and professor of political science at Columbia University, Lincoln Mitchell. How are you, gentlemen?
Doing well.
Excellent. So we have tons to discuss, as always. But I think let's start with Joe Biden, the former vice president of the United States under Barack Obama, and his selection for a running mate. So for the past few months, the three of us have been discussing who Joe Biden will choose, why he will choose this particular person. And now we're getting really close to not only the date that he said he would announce, but also the Democratic National Convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So Lincoln, I'll start with you because you've been pretty vocal about what Joe Biden needs to essentially save the democracy. But where do you think we stand right now with his selection choice? What do you think he will do, and what do you think he should do? And those two may not be the same.
The goal for Joe Biden with his vice presidential nomination is that in 2 days, no one's talking about it anymore. So a vice presidential choice that get people talking, wondering, exploring her background, something she said 10 years ago, that's not good. So this is it's a don't screw up moment rather than try to hit the ball out of the park, excuse the extended baseball analogy. And one thing to suggest is that there's somebody with a little experience would be helpful here. Just as an example, Susan Rice, who is certainly qualified to be president tomorrow, and certainly a very smart woman, has never run for office before. And there are certain difficulties that one encounters, probing questions from reporters about your personal life, your background, your history, your family, that come up when you run for office. And do you really roll the dice with that in something like this? Whereas somebody else who's won a few elections, won a few statewide elections, that seems like a safer bet.
Right, but that's a little difficult when we're thinking about Joe Biden keeping his promise to elect a Black woman, because we know that we've never had a Black female governor in the history of the nation, and we've only had 2 Black female senators, Carol Moseley Braun from Illinois in 1992 and Kamala Harris in California. So if we're looking at someone with statewide qualifications, we've actually whittled down our N quite a bit, don't you think?
Yeah, and for me, the question about the vice presidential nomination has always been, why not Kamala Harris? What's the compelling reason not to nominate Kamala Harris? She's been a senator, she's kind of 2/3 of the way through her first term, but she's won election statewide 3 times in the biggest state in the country. And importantly, when you run in California, attorney general, governor, whatever, you're running a television campaign. You're running a campaign with media scrutiny. So she's been through that before. So looking at this, this is awkward again, but I don't see a compelling reason for not to be Kamala Harris. No one else has come along where I say, aha, that's a better choice than Kamala. It could be a woman who's not African-American. That brings Tammy Duckworth back into play, who I think would be a very good nominee also. But I think if it's either one of those two, Biden is making the safe, smart choice.
Mm-hmm. Matt, I want to bring you in because, I hear Lincoln's rationale. I think that some people are concerned that Senator Harris, I should say, did not connect with voters during the primary season, especially Black voters specifically, who tend to be the base of the Democratic Party. So where do you think Joe Biden is in his selection process, and where do you think he should be?
The entirety of Joe Biden's candidacy is a do no harm candidacy. And this, stems from day one of his announcement to run for president. And for better or worse, he won the primary on that framework. You look at the Democratic electorate today, and it's evident, again, for better or worse, that their single biggest driver, their biggest motivator is to defeat Donald Trump. They don't care about ideology. They don't care about policy. They don't care about the intricacies of governing in this election, I'll say. And so when you look at the VP pick, I would expect Biden to continue the candidacy of do no harm. And for me, that keeps coming back to one person, Senator Harris. For better or worse, she is someone that has been in the national spotlight for years. She is someone where there is nothing hiding in the closet. We know what we know about Kamala Harris. And so it seems evident that that is sort of the direction that Joe Biden is trying to go in, because I agree with Lincoln. I think the single biggest challenge the Biden team faces is a VP pick that upends sort of the dynamics that are going on with this election. And if you go with someone who doesn't have that national exposure and doesn't have that understanding of how to navigate the media landscape nationally, the voter landscape nationally, I think you find yourself with a threat wherein that VP pick, either takes up oxygen in this election dynamic or takes attention away from Donald Trump, which is the single biggest motivator for voters in this election. So I think they're going to do a safe pick because that's frankly the campaign they've been running in this election cycle.
Now, I want to stick with you, Matt, because I definitely agree with you that there's been this kind of safety in running, and essentially it's we're not Donald Trump, therefore vote for us. But I think you mentioned this in one of our previous episodes. Is that enough to galvanize enough people, especially Democrats and independents, weak-leaning Democrats, independents, and weak-leaning Republicans? We know we'll talk about the coronavirus and unemployment in just a moment, but is that strategy enough just to say we're not Donald Trump, so vote for us? Does Joe Biden actually need to put forward, I mean, we know he's got policies, we know he's been putting out policy papers, but should he be a little more aggressive and proactive in what he is choosing to do as president post January 20th, 2021?
Joe Biden's strength is that his character, his person is already defined for voters. And that's the challenge that the Trump campaign has been having over the last few months, right? Is the Trump campaign is essentially zigzagging from one attack to another on Joe Biden that's not working because voters already know who Joe Biden is. And so they tried the China attack, they tried the Hunter Biden attack. Now they've rolled out this new strategy this week where they try to tie Joe Biden to, the quote unquote far left, the Bernie Sanders and the AOCs of the world. That equally is not having the effect that it would have because voters have already made up their minds about both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And so there are very few things in this election cycle that can upend the dynamic wherein voters already have a hardened opinion on both of these candidates. The one thing that could do that is in the VP pick. And I think that is sort of the caution you're seeing from the Biden campaign where, just as a pure instance, let's use Elizabeth Warren, who I personally adore, personally supported, personally think would make a fantastic vice presidential pick. I think one of the reasons you're not seeing her name in contention in these closing days is there's some concern that a pick of Warren would suddenly bring forth a potential argument from the Trump campaign that Biden is veering too far to the left. Whether that would work or not, I doubt. But nonetheless, I think this campaign is trying to avoid those conversations. And you look at their electoral map, places like North Carolina, places like Florida, places like Arizona. They're clearly trying to expand the map this year into states that traditionally haven't voted for Democrats or haven't frequently, and who require a number of independent voters and Republican voters to win those states. And so I think the Biden campaign is looking at this VP pick and saying, who is the candidate that does no harm and allows me to continue with that electoral strategy?
Right. I mean, as you think about expanding the map, I mean, I personally support Stacey Abrams just because of what she was able to do in Georgia. But I recognize that she's a non-traditional choice, and this doesn't seem like a campaign that's willing to go with non-traditional choices right now. But Lincoln, I want to bring you in because Matt said something that really resonated with me, where voters know who Joe Biden is, but also Joe Biden really thrives when it comes to, dare I say, tragedy. I mean, he's been very public about the tragedy that he's experienced in his life, losing his wife, losing his daughter, and then just a few years ago, losing his son. So it seems as though this is a moment because what's been missing from this presidency for so many citizens is that there's been no empathy or compassion. So does Joe Biden, having that reputation of empathy and compassion, need to go with a vice presidential running mate who matches that in some level? Or we know about gender and politics, that will be seen slightly differently coming from a woman. So does your Kamala Harris bid still stand, or how could Joe Biden expand his VP pick by still staying kind of middle of the road where he's been, nice and safe, but possibly doing something different? And who could that be if he chooses to do so?
Full disclosure, I'm not a member of Joe Biden's vice presidential selection committee, so I'm just kibitzing. I don't have a say in this. You're right when you talk about the persona that Joe Biden has. And during this tragedy that has been the COVID-19 pandemic, the lack of Trump's inability and unwillingness to just say, hey, terrible things are happening to America, to go and he have Zoom meetings or something with the families who've lost people is appalling. That comes to Joe Biden very naturally. People generally don't look to the vice president for that. The president is the president is the commander in chief, and the president helps set the moral tone. I think Biden has that. Now, one of the advantages, whether we're talking about Stacey Abrams, Kamala Harris, Tammy Duckworth, Elizabeth Warren, one of the advantages they have over Donald Trump is that they're basically all human beings who have human emotions and know how to relate to other human beings, which is an enormous difference from Donald Trump. So the role of the VP nominee is not going to they will express that sadness at the death and loss because we all feel that way as Americans and as humans. But so I don't think that that's a huge issue. The issue here is there something going to break? I mean, for example, we've seen two stories about Karen Bass, a woman who on some respects I think will be fantastic, that have, I think, taken her out of the nomination. The eulogizing a minor figure in the Communist Party, but they'll make a story of that, and the Scientology link, right? So that takes her out. But Karen Bass clearly was able to govern. She could be president if needed. That's what we need. So you don't need the long story. We don't need any bad press. Somebody who clearly can govern and somebody who has no major scandals. And beyond that, Kamala Harris is no great radical, right? I mean, she's a centrist. You put a Harris on the ticket, you put a Tammy Duckworth on the ticket, you're going to get some carping from the left. I mean, all my old lefty friends in the Bay Area hate Kamala Harris, and for me, what that tells me is that she probably is electable. I am a little hesitant to be too critical of her inability to get African American votes because she got out of the race early, and she got out of the race early, and then basically everyone else besides Bernie and Biden did terribly anyway. So everybody in that race was so strange. So Harris has proven that she can put a big coalition together in California. I think Duckworth needs to be in the mix too, although she's not African American, because her appeal to veterans could be a huge game changer in this. And they both are human, and that's more than you can say in terms of emotional than you can say about Donald Trump at this point.
Right. I mean, I think the concern with Kamala Harris isn't that Black people won't turn out. I think those who are going to vote are going to vote, but I think some of the concern was that the ads that Donald Trump will run, that will be a version of the truth, will be enough to slice off a certain percentage of Black male voters, not necessarily to vote for Trump, but to stay home because they're just disappointed and disgusted with both parties, which we've sort of seen some of that strategy in different ways. But I do, Lincoln, you said something and I want to pick up on that. When we're thinking about coronavirus, so we've been together, the three of us, all summer, every other week, talking about the increase in numbers. And I specifically remember when we, I think, reached the 50,000 mark of deaths due to coronavirus. Now we're at over 150,000 Americans have died from coronavirus. And the president just went and had an interview on Axios on HBO and didn't really know the difference between proportion of population and percentage. Not surprising that he doesn't understand math concepts. But there was this callousness about, he said, I think it is what it is. Will that really resonate? I mean, he's already lost a friend/colleague in Herman Cain due to coronavirus. If these trends keep going, we keep talking about the calcification of Trump supporters, do you see Trump supporters starting to break once these numbers keep going up? Even though we've seen people at the Trump rallies who have lost family members and friends due to coronavirus still supporting the president. Do you see any break in the support as the numbers continue to increase?
I mean, the data points, and Matt probably knows this better than I do, but I'm looking at suburban women, for example, which are breaking very badly against Trump. Now, they broke against Trump, against his party in 2018. Also, if you look at the breakdown of the poll numbers, Biden is now in the low 40s among white voters. And he's trailing Trump in some of the polls by 3, some of the polls by 4, some by 5, just among white voters collectively. If a Democrat stays within 4 or 5 percentage points on white voters, it's not even a close election. What Trump has done is he has kept his base. And that base is very vocal. They call themselves the kind of silent majority. They're neither. They're very vocal. And they're about, I mean, the hardest core of Trump's base is that 25 to 30% who still don't believe that they should wear masks, right? Who still don't believe that social distancing is real. He's kept that. And the reason he's kept that base and not expanded beyond it is he's only campaigned to his base, right? Everything he's done is aimed at energizing his base rather than bringing in new voters. You asked Matt a few moments ago, what is Biden doing to bring in those kind of soft Trump supporters, those independents and Republicans? But we should flip that question on its head a little bit. What is Trump doing, right? He's been president for 3.5 years. And I really, the numbers of people that have said, you know, I voted for Hillary, but I'm ready to give, but he's done a great job and now I'm with Trump, is minuscule compared to the people in the reverse. And given how close the election was in 2016, it's not good news for Donald Trump with, 13 weeks to go till the election.
Matt, what are your thoughts as the numbers continue to rise in response to Lincoln? Trump is not trying to expand the base. Maybe he's counting on voter fraud. Maybe he's counting on the lack of the U.S. Postal Service and no absentee ballots. He seems relatively calm, sort of based on polling, which is, we'll get to that in a moment. But what could he do, or what should he do to respond in a presidential way to where we are right now?
I mean, I've been banging the drum on this for weeks now. I think the irony in the Trump campaign's message is they're not wrong in their message. And what I mean by that is they think this will be a law and order election. And ironically, it's going to be. The fact that it's going to be a law and order election is what will do in Donald Trump. And what I mean by that is if you look at, to Lincoln's point, the suburbs in particular, ex-urban voters, largely white women who single-handedly gave the election to Donald Trump in 2016, you look among those voters and, to be blunt about this, they're freaked out. They are looking at their lives in our society right now and are apoplectic about what they see. They see their kids' future threatened. They see their family's personal health threatened. They see their economic well-being threatened. And the single biggest driver of all of those aspects that are driving voter decision-making is one person, Donald Trump. And so I get the strategy they're trying to use, which is to divert that fear, divert that anxiety to someone else. It's obviously not working, and it hasn't been working for a few years, in part because the single biggest threat to every single one of us in our current society is the man currently in the White House. And so when you look at COVID moving forward, I mean, it's evident at this point, it's not going to get better. We're going to continue to see the threat, the public health threat continue. You're seeing over recent days, the economic news is honestly pretty grim. Unemployment, which had started to tick down, is starting to tick back up because states are realizing, holy cow, we can't reopen our economies in this situation, given the public health threat that we face. And so this is going to continue. And I think particularly over the next few weeks, as schools start to reopen, and there's, I think, a grim realization that a number of districts in a number of states across the country will not be reopening in person, that has a fundamentally significant effect on the average family who needs to worry about going to work every day, who needs to worry about childcare, who's currently facing a situation where the unemployment benefits that they were receiving from the federal government once this crisis began are now running dry because Republicans in Congress refused to pass legislation to re-up that unemployment benefit. We're going to find ourselves in a situation a few weeks from now that is way worse than where we are today. And all of that goes against the president and the campaign he's trying to run. So we'll see if they're able to come up with a strategy over the next few weeks. But the strategy they're currently running is frankly the only thing they can do right now, which is, I guess, to salvage their base and hope that there are other elements at play that are, outside of all of our controls come November. And to your point, I think we start looking at, the threat to voting, the threat to mail-in voting, the attempts to stymie the post office into getting mail out on time. Their strategy is to upend the norms of our election.
Right, and we've seen that. I mean, and the president's been pretty vocal about that, which is concerning a lot of Americans. But I do want to stick with this economic piece, Matt, that you just mentioned, just because so many parents, I think, are coming to the grim realization that their children will not be going to school full time in the next week or two. And so how does Joe Biden then articulate and translate that sort of pocketbook issue? Because we know people vote from pocketbook issues where your child is has an unsteady future. They're at home. You are now picking up the slack if you have a job. Keep in mind, your children are now eating all day at home, which is also another financial burden. Why is it that we're still having this conversation about whether or not it'll be Donald Trump or Joe Biden? I mean, the downward spiral that this country has been in for the last, I won't even say a few years, which we know is the case, but even just the last few months, why has it been so hard for Joe Biden to convince people that they need to change course?
Yeah, I think for me, the interesting element of this entire pandemic is the way in which it's accelerated change and the way it's just disrupted our very sort of bedrock of our society. And I think what it's done is it clearly has shown the systemic challenges, the institutional challenges that exist in our society. And it would suggest to any person looking at it that we need fundamental change. And, you know, just case in point, you bring up sort of the need for some sort of safety net when it comes to childcare, when it comes to paid leave, when it comes to things like that. Democrats have been advocating for federal reform in that area for years. And I think what this issue, this pandemic has presented is a realization to the average voter, the need to have those systems in place, because without them, when we face a crisis like this, when our country faces a challenge, there's not the safety net that's needed to ensure the well-being of our families. And so for Joe Biden, assuming he wins the presidency in November, it's evident at this point that we will need a substantial investment from the federal government in these types of systematic reforms, everything from healthcare to family well-being, to our educational system, to ensuring a fair economy and the implications therein. This is not a time for the federal government to step back and say, it's up to states and localities to figure out what to do in this situation. We've obviously needed a federal response. If we had had a federal response, we currently have tens of thousands of fewer deaths in our country right now. And I think the American people realize that at this point. They realize the fact that had Trump actually stepped up and said, I own this, I am responsible for this, you'll recall he did the exact opposite, we'd have significantly fewer deaths right now, and we'd be looking a lot like the other countries in the world who've gotten this under control. And so I think the Biden presidency needs to be putting together an agenda into next year that fundamentally alters the systems we have in place so that moving forward, we don't face this same crisis again in our country.
Lincoln, before we close, I want to shift gears ever so slightly, because you've been bringing this alarm all summer about our, I would say, not just slow decline into authoritarianism, but how Donald Trump has chipped away at so many norms over the past 3.5 years. And you've been quite concerned and quite vocal about that on this show. And so we know that we have the two conventions coming up, the DNC and the RNC. And this is going to be the first time for the RNC that the press are not allowed into the convention. And so we know that it'll be a truncated convention in Charlotte. They had to cancel the Florida portion because of the coronavirus and the way the president has handled it. But this is really unprecedented. We're used to these 4 days on television and multiple speeches and multiple access with the press. What are your thoughts or concerns on the fact that yet again, we have a new norm of the media as the enemy and no longer invited?
Well, the media as the enemy has been a theme of Donald Trump since he started running for president. And having the Republican convention, I mean, it is worth noting, whether they do it in public or private, that these are living, breathing people who look around and are saying affirmatively, we want this guy to represent our party. And that solidifies the degree to which they are complicit in this Democratic rollback. And it's no wonder they don't want to do that in front of the media. Now they're discussing doing that in the White House lawn, which is, of course, completely illegal. But to me, this is very much part of the broader trend, right? I mean, Trump, a week or two ago, floated the idea of delaying the elections, which is just nonsensical. That's something a child who never understands American law might say. But the reason that strikes me as significant is it gives Republican lawmakers and leaders an out. They can say, we're not for delaying the election. And then when Trump claims election fraud, they can say, see, we're not crazy. We don't want to delay, but we're against mail-in ballots. So this, not to be like a broken record, if our older voters might know what that means here, But this remains a very, very grave threat. Every week that goes by, in my view, there is less reason to believe that Trump will accept the outcome if he loses. And we must begin to focus and organize for that. Otherwise, the Democratic rollback will continue. And in January 2021, Trump and Bill Barr and these people will really try to consolidate this non-democratic regime.
Okay, so we have just 2 minutes to go. What should we be looking for?
Yeah, I think for me, there's really two things. One, we'll obviously see the rollout of the VP pick from the Biden team. Frankly, I'm also looking to Congress, and I don't mean to use my time to knock Democrats in Congress, but frankly, to Lincoln's point that he just made, this is why Democratic voters have been so forceful about the need for accountability. Because look, we're going to get to an election ultimately. The need for accountability remains, and it's frankly disheartening right now to look at Congress and see the lack of action happening. Just for instance, the Oversight Committee, who has control over things like the post office, after news over the last few weeks that the post office has been slowed to prevent potentially mail-in voting from taking place this fall, Democrats have set forth, investigative oversight committee hearings 2 months from now. We need accountability now. And frankly, it's just really disheartening to see the slowness with which Democrats in Congress have taken to holding this administration accountable, to ensuring that we will have a fair election come this November. And frankly, after this election, even if Joe Biden wins, the continued need to hold Republicans accountable for the corruption that's happened over the last few years.
Right. Lincoln, what will you be looking at in the next week or so?
One thing I will continue to look at is whether Republicans continue to jump on the Donald Trump ship of the Titanic right as it's about to hit the iceberg. His numbers are tanking, and will they ever break with him and realize their future lies somewhere else and they need to distance themselves? Because the key here is the Senate. If the Democrats don't win the Senate, Biden does nothing. So for the Republicans, that's a better place to put their resources than a losing presidential candidate.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it seems like some are in for a penny, in for a pound. And we know that Lindsey Graham is in quite a bit of a fight for his seat to remain Republican. And we see across Arizona, Georgia's picking up some really great steam. So we'll see whether or not the Republicans can hold on. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. And so thank you all so much for being here with me again this week. I'm Dr. Christina Greer. You've been watching The Election Show on MNN. Thanks so much for tuning in.